like to welcome Catherine Veron. Catherine works for the States of Alderney, having moved to the island in 2015. Catherine is an icon of local conservation, and she is currently engaged in delivering wildlife protection legislation for the island. Catherine's here to talk to us today about a subject I have great interest in, a new Alderney wildlife law. Thanks, Catherine.
So we're just getting her unmuted, bear with us. Are you with us, Catherine?
Hello, can you hear me?
Perfect.
Great. So thanks very much, John, for that introduction, and delighted to be invited here today to say a few words about Alderney's proposed wildlife and protection legislation. However, I probably ought to start off with a number of apologies. Firstly, I don't have any slides apart from the cover one that you have here of a seal. My second apology is you very much getting the C team. My husband, Paul Veron, was asked to fill in as a last-minute speaker cancellation, and he would have given, I'm sure, a very knowledgeable and enthusiastic talk about gulls in the bailiwick. But unfortunately, he had some work commitments today he couldn't wriggle out of. So you get me for another instalment of what our little island's been up to on the environment front. And my third and final apology, or perhaps it's just me showing off, is that I did the preparation for this presentation very, very last minute while sitting on a rocky shore on a very tiny island off Alderney called Veron, where there was no running water or electricity. And this is where my friend the seal comes in, because as I was writing the notes, she bobbed up in the water just about 20 feet or so from us. So I thought she would be the icon of my presentation. I'm also delighted to report that we now have a really strong population of grey seals on the rocks off the back of Veron, which I'm really pleased to see. So on to that wildlife legislation. The protection of wildlife legislation for Alderney came about really from the Blue Island Conference that was hosted by Gibraltar government back in 2019, which was about a general discussion on wildlife protection. However, it was cancelled at the last minute. And so Alderney offered, because we were hosting the IIEM that year, for us to co-host the signing of the charter with Gibraltar in Alderney later that year. Gibraltar agreed to that, and Alderney was one of the first of the jurisdictions to sign the charter, which gave a number of non-legally binding commitments, including to protect nature, terrestrial and marine species and habitats, and enhance biodiversity. So following the signing of the charter, Alderney needed to ensure that it followed through with some action. And to that end, we agreed an environmental policy for the government over here and began work on developing legal protection for our wildlife as part of that policy. We did look to other jurisdictions, primarily Guernsey, to see if there was a quick fix solution readily available to save on resources and repeated effort. But after a promising start, it soon became clear that wildlife legislation wasn't going to be prioritised for action by the powers that be in Guernsey. That being the case, and having signed the charter, we started to ask around for help from other quarters. It was at this point that the Alderney Wildlife Trust stepped in and offered to help the government over here through their head office contacts with the UK legal firm Hogan Lovells, who were prepared as part of their corporate environment responsibilities to provide legal advice free of charge for the drafting of guidelines along wildlife protection. We then had COVID, but this did provide a good project for their legal team to work on during lockdown. So a number of Skype, Zoom meetings with the team from Hogan Lovells and Roland Govine from the Wildlife Trust in Alderney, and myself as Officer of the States of Alderney, set about building up a set of guidelines based around the UK wildlife protection law, but taking into account the small nature of Alderney and its limitations in terms of resources. I had hoped originally that the legislation might include some animal welfare aspects to it, but we did have the remit of keeping it simple, so this soon became apparent that we weren't going to be able to do this. So what does the law contain? At the moment, it's designed to cover the terrestrial environment extending to the intertidal zone, but not the marine environment. We just felt that there was going to be too much conflict with sort of fisheries and Brexit issues, so we've limited it to the intertidal zone. It falls into 3 parts, which you're probably aware from the UK Wildlife Act. Part 1 places a duty on public bodies and office holders to further conservation of biodiversity. Part 2 provides protection for specific habitats and supports the protection already in place of our via our local building development control law. It's intended that the wildlife legislation would allow the states in time to designate existing state-owned land as areas of enhanced protection. We're thinking really here of the Longy Nature Reserve and Veron and the West Coast and reefs under the Ramsar site. These areas all have agreed management plans in place. At this stage, there's no intention whatsoever to designate any privately owned land as areas of enhanced protection. However, possibly in time, if landowners wanted to apply for that, that could be a discussion with the state. And then part 3, which I feel is the most important part from my perspective anyway, is the protection of specific birds, animals and plant species. So we're looking at using what's already listed under the UK Wildlife Act, and we'll look at Guernsey's bird protection list, and of course now Jersey as well with their revised legislation. But of course we'll have to put it into the context of Alderney, so there may be a few species that are specific to Alderney. The legislation will fall under the responsibilities of a specified States of Alderney committee, but we are looking at proposing that a set of volunteers from professional conservation bodies or wildlife science institutions would be brought together to advise the States of Alderney on their responsibilities under the law, and we'd refer to this group as the Scientific Advisory Group. At this stage, we're looking at repealing the existing Protection of Wild Birds Alderney Ordinance from 2005, really on the basis of trying to keep it simple. And that's the only major sort of existing legislation in Alderney. It just makes sense to put it all under one piece of legislation. So the next stage after the guidelines were drawn up was to seek political support, which was forthcoming from our Policy and Finance Committee. They agreed that the guidelines were suitable, but asked that we do a public consultation exercise with interested parties. So we're now in that phase of seeking input from interested parties. We've approached groups such as the Animal Welfare, Golf Course, Alderney Bird Observatory, landowners, Kiln Farm, the Shooting Club, Chamber of Commerce, other states departments, and just a general invite to members of the public who may have an interest in this area. I do find this quite an interesting phase of the development of the law. And it's when my friend the seal pops up again, having been told by one of the consultees that there were too many of the grey seals in our waters, and that really we ought to be culling them for the benefits of fish stocks. On the plus side, however, the majority of feedback has been really positive, with some useful amends suggested, and we'll take those forward. I'm sure, however, the question of why does Alderney need wildlife legislation will raise its head during this public consultation part. But I guess at the moment, we've got no real avid hunters in Alderney. Well, none that make a big impact on the environment over here anyway. but it only takes one individual to make a massive difference in this island that's only 3 miles by 1. And with such a mobile population, I think it's currently about 50% turnover every 10 years in Alderney. So it's better to be prepared. I also hark back to that Blue Islands Charter we signed, and it's what better way to show our commitment than actually having it written down in law, how much we value our environment. So if Alderney really does value its environment credentials, then we need to show it more than just in more than just fine words, both for the quality of life of residents on the island and the economic value of green and blue tourism. If I'm being honest though, it also was a great opportunity offered to us, the Estates of Alderney, by the Alderney Wildlife Trust. We could get all this work done for free, no cost to the taxpayer. And usually environmental protection appears at the bottom of the pile for bailiwick governments. So it would just be simply foolish of us not to take this opportunity. Whilst the guidelines are not perfect, they do provide us with an outline of what we hope to put in place for Alderney's wildlife protection. More details need to be added. We have to develop the species lists for protection and exemption. We need to Alderneyfy it as well. There's some cross-references that need to be made with existing local legislation, such as the Alderney Firearms Law. So there's still a bit of work to be done. I'm already failing on my timeline, really in the interest of making sure I get all the public input that's necessary. And so we've slipped quite considerably. I had hoped to have something finalised in the way of guidelines for our current cohort of politicians in Alderney, who have all been very supportive of the work to date. But unfortunately, half of them potentially will change in November this year. And I just don't know whether they'll be as supportive with the potential new cohort. However, once we've got all the public feedback back, I hope to finalise the drafting instructions ready for St James Chambers in Guernsey early next spring. But be very interested if anybody has any comments from this forum. Delighted to share the draft guidelines that we've got. And of course, I'll be following what Jersey's doing later this year with great interest. So that about wraps up from me. Thank you very much for your time.